Hello and welcome to Chapter 15 on multinationals and migration, international factor movements. So first of all, we start with the two factors of production that can move. Land really can't move. I guess entrepreneurs can move, but anyway, we don't consider them in this chapter. We consider just the labour moving, which obviously is migration. And secondly, we consider capital moving. And that is obviously where companies basically take over companies in other countries, or individuals purchase property in other countries. That in turn is called FDI, or foreign direct investment. And FDI is funding provided by investors, usually firms, to establish or acquire foreign companies, foreign assets in other words, or to expand or finance existing foreign companies that the investors own. So for example, two forms of FDI would be either, let's just take the company Coca-Cola, which has operations all over the world. If Coca-Cola decided to expand its plant in Kenya because of increased demand for soft drinks there, then that would be FDI into Kenya and out of the US. Now, if Coca-Cola looked at Thailand and didn't have any operations there, they probably do, but already. But if they didn't have operations there and they looked at Thailand and they said, "Oh, we want to have a plant there. We want to set up operations there in Thailand," then if they decided, "Okay, well, we're going to purchase an existing company that makes something close to Coca-Cola, but it's not Coca-Cola." But it has the bottling plant already, and all we have to do is buy the company and then just change out the ingredients and the branding and everything, and we got our product. So that's one thing that they could do. They could buy out that company completely. And the reason why I'm picking Coca-Cola, by the way, is Coca-Cola's formula, as you know, is secret. So Coca-Cola isn't about to tell anyone what's in its product, so it's not going to go into any joint ventures on that. It wants to have complete control over its product. So that will be FDI. And then we can have Greenfield FDI. So Greenfield FDI means that Coca-Cola looks at Thailand, so I'll use the same example, but says, "Oh, we're not going to take over an existing company. We don't like them, and we don't like their operations, and they've had problems with this or that or the other. We're going to build our own factory there." So that would also be FDI, but it would be a special type of FDI. It's called Greenfield FDI. Okay, so of those different types of FDI, the most common, incidentally, FDI is also where citizens, say a US citizen wanted to buy a cottage or something in South Africa, that would be FDI into South Africa, because it would be a US citizen purchasing assets or building assets, if the person decided to build the house in South Africa. So the key here is sufficient ownership or control, and control can often be gained with just 10% ownership. How? Well, you see a lot of these hedge funds in the US take 10% control and then threaten to do all sorts of things to the company if they don't put one of their guys on the board. And the activist investors, they're called. Consequently, the company usually accedes to that, and then that person has an influence on the company. Well, here we just say that the agreed international standard is at least 10% ownership, so it's 10% and above. Okay, which type of companies? So we're going to focus on the companies and not the individuals purchasing property when we talk about FDI. So it's the type of company that's going to do FDI into a developing country is a special type of firm. It's what we call a multinational enterprise, or an MNE. This is a firm that owns and controls operations in more than one country. So the parent firm of the MNE is located in the home country. So to take my example of Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola is an American brand, and its home country is therefore the US. The home country is the source country for the outward FDI. In other words, the decisions about worldwide operations will be made in or at the headquarters of Coca-Cola, which is based, I believe, just outside Atlanta, as I recall. But anyway, I might be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure it's just outside Atlanta. Either Pepsi or Coke is based there, and I think it's Coke. But anyway, we'll be based in, obviously, wherever the headquarters is based. The M&E has one or more affiliates located in one or more host countries. So the terminology we use is if it's a subsidiary. I prefer the term subsidiary to affiliate, but you get the idea. It's one or the other, or you can use them interchangeably. Located in one of the host countries, then that defines the host country as basically allowing the subsidiary or the affiliate to set up shop in their country. So Coca-Cola sets up shop in Kenya, or Coca-Cola sets up shop in Thailand. The host country is the destination country for the inward FDI. So from the developing country's point of view, the money coming into the country is thought of as inward FDI. So it's inward to whatever country the M&E is investing in. One thing you've got to be aware of here is, of course, when we look at tables that the Bureau of Economic Statistics produces for Bureau of Economic Analysis, produces for the US, for example, it produces tables on flows of FDI and stocks of FDI. And you got to understand the difference between the two. I'm sure you do understand the difference between stocks and flows. But a flow variable obviously is the amount of money that goes out of the country, in this case is FDI, and into the foreign country. We also look at the amount of money that comes out of foreign countries and is invested into the US as well. Because remember, there's an FDI flow from foreign countries who might want to set up subsidiaries here in the US. Incidentally, one of the interesting points here, I never realized this until I looked at the statistics. The biggest source of FDI coming into the US, so it's firms setting up subsidiaries or expanding subsidiaries into the US, comes from the UK. Now, I thought that was quite incredible. It's also the biggest source for the UK. The biggest source of FDI coming into the UK comes from the US as well. So that came as a surprise because, the UK is very close to the EU. Well, it was until recently at any rate. And also it comes as a surprise from the US end because, we do a lot more trade with other countries other than the UK. So why the UK should have a specific interest in setting up subsidiaries here is kind of a little surprising to begin with, until you start thinking about companies such as banks. I think I was looking the other day, and I think the 8th biggest bank in the US is HSBC, which is based in the UK. Hong Kong Shanghai Bank actually is its name, but it's based in the UK. It has its headquarters in the UK. Therefore, any expansion of the HSBC in the US would be UK outward FDI, US inward FDI. Okay, so that's flows. So the outward and the inward in particular relates to flows. We've also got to bear in mind that the flow, once it's happened, becomes a stock. So in other words, the US, a US multinational invests in a foreign country. Well, then they built the assets there, and then it's a stock of FDI. So it becomes assets that US corporations hold abroad. So you've got to distinguish between the two, because the two are very different. So now we kind of do a little detour and say, well, why do these M&Es exist to begin with? So there are inherent disadvantages of operating a foreign affiliate competing against local firms. Oftentimes you're the outsider when you're bringing a product to market in that country, unless the product is a completely new product. But there are certain firm-specific advantages of the MNE, especially intangible assets. Now, intangible assets, what I mean by that, what he means by that is, first of all, branding. Second of all, experience and marketing. And particularly for developing countries, I find it's aspirational to own products that come from the West for some reason. I don't know why that is, because they're not always better made, but that is certainly the case. When I've been to developing countries, I do notice this aspirational thing about, oh, we own something that's American, you know, it's good. Or we own something that's German, it's great, or Japanese or whatever. So that's that can come through. Location factors based on resource costs and availability. Obviously, you know, some of the larger multinationals are engaged in things like mineral and obtaining minerals and mining. So those resource costs are often much lower abroad, but not just that. They're often much less explored than they are in the US, for example. So location factors based on resource costs and availability. Customer demand. Often you can find new markets abroad which which don't exist. You've already exploited in this country, so you've got to move abroad to extend the demand for your products. Government policies. Many governments are very friendly to FDI. They see it as a very easy way to boost the amount of investment that goes on in their country, and also to increase employment, obviously, and other considerations. Internalizational advantages in using these assets as well. This can create a supply chain, for instance. So internal to the firm, you might find that the firm sets up in a specific country because it wants to partially assemble a product, for example, and then ship it elsewhere for completion of the assembly. Could be that as a good example of an internalization advantages. And oligopolistic rivalry that uses FDI and the firm's strategies for competing. Oligopolistic competition is an industry structure that has very few players, so key players. So let's take, for instance, Airbus and Boeing. You know, Boeing might decide, okay, well, we're going to set up a subsidiary in Argentina, and that's going to service South America for plane parts. That means that the alternative to Boeing is Airbus, of course. They're likely to do the same then. They're going to compete. They're probably going to want to set up a subsidiary. They may go to the same country, Argentina, or they may choose a different country, Brazil. But they probably don't want to leave that market out, and they also want to be able to say to their potential clients in South America, look, we can supply parts to our planes easily because we have a warehouse that we've set up already in country X. Okay, one thing that's come into the news really in a big way recently, and this was really came from the election campaign of the current president, is taxation of M&E's profits. Profits of M&Es come from the operations of the parent firms and their foreign affiliates, their foreign subsidiaries. National governments impose taxes on business profits, and there are many tax details here which I don't want to get into, but basically most governments tax companies, including foreign subsidiaries operating within the borders, based on the profitability of the companies in their countries. So the host country governments tax the profits of the local affiliates of the M&Es, as I said. So for instance, whatever profit is made by Coca-Cola in Thailand, Thailand would basically charge corporate taxes against that. And the home country government taxes the parent company's local profits earned on its own activities. By the way, this is very inconsistent compared to the way in which the US government, for instance, taxes individuals. I don't know if you're aware of this, but if, for instance, you work in another country and you get taxed by that country, then you still have to declare that to the US government, and unless the US government has a tax treaty with that country, you will be taxed again. You'll be taxed twice. Now notice that for companies, that's not the case. So companies kind of get off lightly there. So because tax rates vary across host countries, and because global M&Es try to minimize the total tax bill that they have to pay, two important issues arise. M&Es are going to shop around among the countries to locate its affiliates in the jurisdictions with governments offering the lowest tax rates possible, or big tax breaks to begin with. So you often find that in locating in a certain state within the US, if it's incoming FDI into the US, or countries in Europe, if it's incoming FDI into the European Union, the countries, or the states in the case of the US, are going to compete, and they're going to offer lots of incentives for the M&Es to be based in their particular jurisdiction. One of the most famous ones, I think, is Ireland. Ireland in Europe, which basically doesn't charge hardly any corporate tax for the first, I think it's 10 years or something, but there's a tax holiday basically where they don't pay much at all. And then the same in the US. Georgia and South Carolina have attracted a lot of foreign investment. You'll see that I think it's Volkswagen has its main plant in South Carolina for the US, basically because South Carolina offered it a really, really good deal in terms of taxes. M&Es can also use what we call transfer pricing to report more of their profits in those lower tax countries. Now this is partially what has been very controversial. I think the biggest example of this was really hit the news recently was Starbucks, that was taxed less in Ireland than anywhere else in Europe. So what it did is it transferred a lot of its income revenue that it was earning from selling, macchiatos and Americanos and all the rest of it, over to Ireland and declared it in Ireland. The European Commission fined Starbucks actually a huge amount, and as I recall, Starbucks appealed on that basis. Apple was also caught out doing this as well, and Apple was fined a huge amount by the European Commission. I think Apple appealed, but it lost its appeal, and it still had to pay up. It was billions of dollars. I remember that much. So the M&Es are heavily involved in international trade. About 1/3 of the world's trade is actually intra-firm trade. So that means a multinational enterprise like Coca-Cola doing trade with its own subsidiaries. So maybe the contents of some of the Coca-Cola drinks will be shipped out from the US, etc. Now, Coca-Cola is probably a very good example there, but for instance, in vehicle assembly, I know that Volkswagen has also a vehicle assembly plant in Mexico, and there's a lot of trade that goes on between the German headquarters of Volkswagen and the subsidiaries in different countries around the world. Another 1/3 of the world's international trade involves an M&E as the seller or exporter or buyer trading with other firms. So when you think about it, the M&Es account for 2/3 of all the trade going on in the world. A third, the trade is accounted for them trading between the parents and subsidiaries of these companies, and a third is accounted for by the trading of these companies outside of themselves, if you like. In many industries, a firm must find a reasonable trade-off between centralizing production in one or a few locations and exporting to many other countries to achieve economies of scale. See, one of the issues that many M&Es have is, okay, where do we set up the plant on this particular continent? And then we've got to try and serve the other countries in that continent. And by the way, that's why these regional integration projects become important for multinational enterprises. If you look at Europe, most M&Es are going to think, well, we're just going to set up in one country. Why would we set up in two? So I'm talking about foreign M&Es locating in Europe. Many of them have chosen Ireland, as we talked about. Some of them choose other countries for different reasons. It really depends. Spreading production to many host countries where the buyers are to reduce transport costs or to avoid actual or threatened barriers to importing into those countries or to gain local marketing advantages. So there are certain products like Coca-Cola where Coca-Cola wants to actually have presence in many other countries. Why? Because it can do its advertising campaigns and it can really not worry about tariffs between countries and etc. etc. So Coca-Cola has a huge presence around the world. Obviously, a company that's like a retail company like Walmart, in that case, they're going to, they're not just going to set up in one country, they're going to set up in several countries where they think there's a significant market that hasn't been exploited, and they can bring their particular brand of retailing to bear on those countries. So there are good reasons to think that FDI and trade could be substitutes or complements. What do we mean by that? That trade and FDI could go together in the sense that if a company decides to do some FDI into a particular country, that country could then form a kind of a hub, and from that hub, the company could export into other countries in that continent or in that regional area, that region. Good example of this might be Volkswagen's setting up plants in certain key countries on each continent. So for instance, in Africa, they're based in South Africa, and they're from South Africa, they export from South Africa their Volkswagen vehicles through to other African countries. On the other hand, the FDI and trade could be substitutes. In other words, if you do FDI into a country, then you don't have to export to that country anymore. You can just produce the product there. So for instance, that might be the case with Coca-Cola. If it's going to set up in a foreign country, then there's not going to be any trade then between, or the trade that will occur is just the raw materials or the some of the components, but not the whole product. So FDI could cause less trade as well. Most studies conclude that FDI on average is somewhat complementary to international trade. So in other words, when FDI is done, it tends to increase trade on a global basis. So should the home country restrict FDI outflows? Well, we can identify several key effects. The effect on workers and others who provide inputs into production in the home country. Remember that if FDI goes on, it means there's less probably going to be produced to be exported from that home country. The effects on the owners of the M&Es based in this home country. And the effects on the government budget, especially on government tax revenues, because of course they won't capture those taxes anymore as the product is going to be made abroad. Any external benefits or costs associated with direct investment outside of the country. Those are also effects. So should the host country restrict FDI inflows. So here we're looking at the opposite end. So a country that's about to receive investment coming in from abroad. Standard static analysis of FDI finds workers in the host country gain from increased demand for their services, as do other suppliers of inputs to the affiliates of these foreign multinationals. When Volkswagen went and set up in South Africa, that added to the number of workers in demand in the area where they set up. Obviously, the workers in that area of South Africa gained. But not just that, Volkswagen also had to assemble parts manufacturers, otherwise it'd have to import the parts. And so a whole kind of supply network of parts for Volkswagens sprang up in South Africa. So the host country government also gains from the taxes collected on the affiliate profits, as long as these exceed the extra costs of any additional government services provided to the affiliates. So go back to my example, Volkswagen in South Africa, any profits that they make, they obviously have to pay to the South African government. Not any profits, but a percentage of the profits as part of a corporate tax regime. Domestic firms that must compete with the affiliates lose. Obviously, if there are domestic firms, I don't know any domestic car makers in South Africa, but there you go. If there were, they would lose. Overall, there's a presumption that the host country gains well-being in this standard analysis. There's other effects as well, and those are things like training, foreign management techniques as well, and foreign companies, certainly in developing countries, tend to be very much more generous to their workers. They tend to be able to pay better wages than local companies, and so they are able to hire the best workers, and that consequently can also have spin-off effects for the country concerned, because those workers can then go on to maybe start their own businesses. They've got better management techniques, they've got skills which they didn't have before and they wouldn't have got otherwise, maybe from a local company. So there are other spin-off benefits as well. So this is what this is talking about here. The host country must also weigh indirect economic benefits with respect to incoming FDI, including any positive externalities. And that's a positive externality because it's an effect on the third party. In other words, whatever that worker may go on to do, and the skills of that worker and the benefit to the rest of the economy. So M&Es bring technology, marketing capabilities, and managerial skills to that country. And while an M&E attempts to keep these intangible assets to itself, some of them inevitably spill over into the local economy, into local firms. Okay, so that's FDI and M&Es. That's the first half of the chapter. Here we go into the second half of the chapter. This is talking about labor migration. So migration is the movement of people from one country, the sending country, to another country, the receiving country, in which they plan to reside for some noticeable period of time. And this has played an enormous role in the expansion of certain countries, those that have taken in large amounts of immigrants. So, for example, Germany is a very good example of that, as is the UK, as is US, and as is Australia and Canada too. And this is a good little chart because it compares Australia and Canada. And I know that the US takes in more immigrants than Canada, but that's not what this chart shows. This chart shows that really you should measure immigrants as a percentage of the existing population. So this is annual immigrants per 1,000 of population. And you can see that for Canada, it's roughly twice, and it has been for several decades, roughly twice the level of immigration on a relative basis compared to the US. I don't think a lot of people know that, but it's kind of interesting. And notice that Canada's level of immigration as a percentage of the population since looks like around 1915 has consistently been higher than the US relative migration. So Canada in a way, is a lot more open country to immigration from abroad. I guess they've got a lot more space up there as well, although most of it's completely unusable because it's so cold. But anyway, here's the EU. Now, there's been a lot in the press about immigration into the EU, and a lot of it comes from Syria, obviously, with the war there. But I think a lot of Africans have also piggybacked off that, and you've also seen a large uptick in immigration from Middle Eastern countries like Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, etc. So you can see that in those two spikes there going into 2015, 2013. So those are the 28 EU countries. You can see the net immigration per thousand of population in the EU, certainly during the 60s and 70s, it really didn't amount to much. It only started really increasing in the late 80s, 1980s. And from then on, it's been increasing quite dramatically. Now, notice the net immigration peaked out at around 5. Let's go back to the previous diagram, 5 per thousand of population. You can see 5 per thousand of population is, the US is down at roughly 4, 3.5, and Canada's up at about 7. So even the levels that the EU has had are not as high as for Canada. So, and this once again is controversial, but we can do some kind of pretty objective analysis here. But of course, levels of migration is a very political topic, so I'm going to steer well clear of that here. So how migration affects labour markets. Freer migration makes wage rates in the migrant-related occupations more equal between countries. Obviously, wage rates in the country where the migrants are leaving will tend to increase, as we're going to see in a minute, and in the industries where those migrants go to work in the receiving country, their wages are going to tend to fall just from demand and supply. So directly competing workers in the receiving countries have their pay lowered relative to less immigrant-threatened occupations and relative to such non-labour incomes as land rents. Immigrants' earnings catch up partly within their own lifetimes, and world output is raised by allowing more immigration. So that's why generally economists say that legal immigration, I'm not talking about illegal, I'm talking about legal immigration is a good thing. And pretty much the whole of the economics profession is aligned on that. Of course, it is legal immigration we're talking about, and not illegal. Most economists don't want to really talk about illegal immigration because it's a very political subject, and the findings are really difficult to come by because, of course, you're dealing with subjects that are illegal or illegally in this country or illegally in Europe or wherever they are illegally. Did we cover all that? Yes, we do. Okay, this is a diagram that shows these effects. So let's run through this diagram. On the left-hand side, you can see the North country. So by North, think of the US. You can see the wages start off at $6 initially. And initially without the migration in the South country, so this is obviously the developing country, the wages start off at $2. So $6 and $2. So there's a $4 difference per hour in the wages. Then we get migration. So we get a certain number of people. Let's say it's 90 million, 90 minus 70 million. So that's that bracketed distance M in the right-hand diagram and in the left-hand diagram. But let's concentrate on the right-hand diagram first. So if you notice the supply curve to the right, by the way, this is the labor market, if you can see that. So the demand for labor, that downward sloping demand for labor curve is the demand by firms. The upward sloping supply curve is the supply of labor by households. So we start off at point A in the right-hand diagram, which is where the supply of the amount of workers remaining plus the migrants who are about to leave are initially. So supply equals demand at point A, and therefore the salary is, or the wage is $2 per hour. Then a bunch of people decide to migrate. So the supply curve in that south country shifts from SR plus SMIG to just SR. So it shifts to that blue supply curve to the left. And you can see what that means is that the wages of the remaining workers, that's why it's S subscript R, increases from $2 to $3.20. There are less employed, yes, because of course 20 million have migrated. So that's why you've got that distance M, which is 20 million. Now let's have a look at what happens in the northern country. In the northern country, of course, what it means is basically the supply curve shifts down to the right, but it actually shifts horizontally by 20 million. It has to, because that's the new people are there, that are there. So what that causes is to move from point A to point B. That means in this particular industry, wages have fallen from $6 an hour to $5 an hour. So notice we've got these shaded areas. Oh, by the way, in the northern country, it means 110 million are hired. So that's basically an increase from what would be supplied in the north, which isn't 100 million anymore because we moved down the supply curve. So less domestic, less northern residents will want to actually work at these lower wages. So the distance there once again is 20, but notice that some of the northern workers who were working are now no longer working. So let's look at who gains and who loses. The migrants gain the area E plus F. Basically, that's the distance between $2 and $3.20 times essentially the 20 million. I'm not sure that's correct actually. No, it isn't. So forget that for the moment. Let's look at the two diagrams. So what happens in the foreign country? What happens is you've obviously got, for the workers that remain, their salary has gone up from $2 to $3.20. So the workers that remain, they capture that square D. So that goes to the workers remaining in the south. They gain that area D. The southern employers, they were getting labor for $2 an hour. They now lose that area because we've moved up the demand curve. So they lose the surplus of D plus E. So that's gone. D, they're having to pay to the existing workers. I suppose that means E must go to the migrants. So that's probably how we're going to get that result. So in general, they lose E. And look in the left-hand diagram, the native northern workers, they're going to lose that area A. Why? Because they were able to supply their labor at $6 an hour. They're only able to supply it now at $5, and therefore they're going to cut back on the amount of work that they do. But so they've lost that area A. It's like a producer surplus here. It's like a worker surplus has gone. The northern employers, however, gain the area A plus B. So if the developed country, the northern workers, lose A and the northern employers gain A, that cancels out, but they also gain B. So once again, the north gains the area B. Okay, so they gain the area B in the north, and in the south, the workers remaining in the south lose that area. Gain that area D, but the firms lose D and E, so they lose E. So if we look at the and for some reason the migrants gain that area E plus F. I'm not sure quite the logic of that E plus F there. But anyway, they gain that E plus F. But the world gains basically B and F. It gains those two areas. So in other words, the world is better off by that migration happening. Good. Should the sending country restrict immigration? So the sending country loses national well-being. By the way, that's one reason why most developing countries do not like to lose, particularly their qualified labour. Qualified meaning degree, they've earned a degree. The effects on the sending country government budget are that they're going to lose the future tax payments that immigrant would have made. And those who emigrate no longer require government goods, services and public assistance, so government spending goes down. So that's good, I suppose. But as far as the government's concerned as well, their labour, the quality of the labour in the country, because usually or often it's high quality labour that leaves. Sometimes it's not, but often it is. So the sending country benefits from remittances sent home by immigrants as well. In fact, the biggest remittance flow in the world is from the US to Mexico. Should the receiving country restrict immigration? That's a very topical issue. Well, the receiving country gains national well-being, and there are effects on the government budget. So government tax and other revenues coming from immigrants, but there's also government spending on those immigrants as well, particularly if it takes them the time to settle. And there are external costs and benefits as well. There can be knowledge benefits. That's why we have in the US, we have special immigration policies for doctors, and and for other professions that are in demand. Another cost could be congestion costs. So having more people in the country doesn't necessarily improve wait times in congestion in major urban centers, and also it can cause social friction as well as a cost. What all the research tends to find is that there is a bigger net benefit likely if the immigrant is a young adult, better educated, and in good health. Why? Because obviously they don't require government services usually, but also that they have a longer period over which to contribute to the receiving country. And also, if they're better educated as well, it means that they can contribute immediately.